Hi there. In this video, we'll be talking about the first years of the new American Republic. What we'll be talking about in class, and as you do the reading, is a number of different attempts to define what American democracy should look like. We'll talk about a whole raft of different notions here: the reach and purpose of the federal government, the place of slavery in a democracy, women's role in American society, whether family life ought to reflect democratic ideals, and how politicians and voters ought to be expected to behave, a question you can see here that had some relevance. I'm not going to go through each of these topics here. Instead, I want you to think through these issues on your own as you read. What I'm going to do here is to define a key idea, republicanism, that helped determine how Americans worked through almost all of these issues, and talk briefly about one direction in which that idea could be taken. At the very heart of the way Americans thought about how to define their new nation was the notion of republicanism. Now, let me be clear, this had nothing directly to do with the modern political party, the Republican Party, which didn't exist at this time, as we'll see later. Republicanism is a simple enough idea, and in its American incarnation, it meant this: virtue protects liberty from the encroachment of power. Or, to put it a different way, power is nefarious and ever-threatening. In any society, it's always threatening to overturn democracy or overturn what the people want. So if you want to preserve liberty in that society, you're going to need a lot of virtuous citizens standing at the gates. Now, republicanism referred back to the political system of ancient Greece and Rome, which idealized versions of this ideology, although, in 2,000 years, things got a little twisted around at times. The American founders for those classical states explains why there are so many statues around of those founders wearing togas. They didn't wear togas in real life, I should clarify. I would note about these statues that A, George Washington is surprisingly cut, and B, I've never been so grateful to see Benjamin Franklin wearing a shirt. Anyway, let me explain a little bit further. Republicanism holds that a functioning democracy depends on people making decisions not for themselves, but for the nation, on people looking past their own self-interest and thinking about the national interest. So if you're going to let people decide things, or as we would put it, if you're going to let people vote, they need to be free to think for themselves. That's the liberty part. They have to have the freedom to make decisions for themselves. But Americans saw power not as good, the way that, say, hip-hop moguls or Mr. Burns on The Simpsons sees it, but as inherently corrupt and especially threatening to liberty. So if a citizen could be bought off or intimidated by a corrupt businessman or politician's power, if a citizen wasn't powerful enough to confront more powerful entities than himself, then you couldn't trust him to make the best decisions for the country. You couldn't trust him to vote. So that's power. So a democracy depended on a never-ending supply of virtuous citizens, people who could put the interests of the nation above their own petty desires and to keep liberty safe from power. The problem, of course, arose when it came time to define these terms. What exactly did liberty, power, and virtue mean? What threatened liberty more? Was it money that threatened liberty? Was it government? Or was it mob rule? Could you best protect Americans from power's incursions by making government bigger or by making it smaller? If it's bigger, then perhaps government itself is the power. If it's smaller, then perhaps it can't fight against the power of really rich people, for instance. Did virtue mean being rich enough to... Hey, there's the dog. Did virtue mean being rich enough to set aside your own concerns and think about what others needed? Or did it mean living in rustic poverty? You will see as you read how both political parties, and all political parties really, referred to Republican ideas in formulating their platforms and in appealing to voters. You will see also how Americans in almost any context look to these ideas as they attempted to define how they and their neighbors and their leaders should act. So here's a Jefferson poster nailing Adams for being corrupt and unrepublican, down with the British faction. That really suggests that Adams, Jefferson's opponent, is attempting to be a king, an emperor or a king, the iron grasp of a British Tory faction. So that's how Jefferson was attempting to nail Adams as being corrupt and unrepublican. However, you can be sure, of course, that Adams' posters said the same thing about Jefferson. For an example of how far the notion of republicanism could stretch, I'd like to talk briefly about companionate marriage. Here it is, companionate marriage. Now, companionate marriage simply means a married couple, the members of a married couple, thinking of the other member as his or her favorite companion. Surprisingly, I should say, marrying for love was pretty new in this society. For a long time, most people had married for economic or family reasons. But the American Revolution, along with the rise of middle-class lifestyles and values, made it much more possible for men and women to think about marrying for love rather than for money or because it's what their parents said they should do. Now, this would seem, on its surface, to be unrelated to politics, but I'll say that it relates to politics and to the idea of republicanism in two ways. First, companionate marriage assumed that a happy home was crucial to a well-functioning society. So to have politics work right, Americans believed that you had to have husbands and wives working well together too. This was at least partially because the Americans in the middle class had begun to develop an idea that men, in order to work well in the world, needed to come home to a happy home, specifically a home in which women were taking care of the child, and then the man, after a day out in the corrupt, problematic world, could come home to a virtuous wife who would, let him put his feet up and hand him his pipe and show him a happy baby and stuff. Now, the second reason companionate marriage has to do with republicanism is that it implied a sort of equality among the members of a marriage. You can't be best friends or best companions with someone if you're much more or less powerful than he or she is. So men and women were supposed to be relatively equal. So in the midst of a revolutionary desire for equality and for Republican virtue, a happy marriage of equals now took on far greater importance than it ever had before. So when you're thinking about the way that married couples are describing their relationships with their spouses, try to think of the wider implications of what they're saying. Their dreams, their fears, and their anxieties frequently tied into how they thought not just about their marriage or their home life, but about their country, their nation itself. And I think when you look elsewhere into American society, you will see that not just marriage, but almost every aspect of their social, economic, cultural, and political lives was informed by the notion of trying to be more Republican, specifically trying to protect liberty from the corrupting influence of power. So all of that begs the question, and it's a question that historians have been asking a lot lately, which is, just how seriously did Americans take this stuff? How closely did their actions follow their ideology? Their ideology says, for instance, that the very fate of the nation depends on this happy home here. Historians, however, in the past few years have begun to wonder whether Americans actually lived that reality, whether they took those notions seriously. So as you're reading and thinking, not just about marriage, but about life in the Republic in general, think about the extent to which Americans' ideas had changed since before the Revolution. Think about whether or not they let those changes affect their actions, and think about whether or not Americans are actually that worried about the Republic. Whether historians have perhaps overinterpreted or overtold that story.